Part 1, Panel Discussions with Extensive Quotations of Examples Offered by Patients. This is Mental Health Through Will Training by Abraham Lowe. Part 1. 1. Imagination, Temper, and Symptoms. A panel discussion conducted by patients. Frank, panel leader. The panel is ready to start, and we are taking our material from the lecture entitled The Wrong-Fearing Temperament. What we are going to discuss is the dilemma, which means a difficulty of making decisions. Has anybody an example of having trouble making up his mind? Tilly, some time ago I went to Fields and wanted to get a dress for my little daughter Doris. I couldn't make up my mind between two dresses. I looked at both dresses and felt confused. And when I can't make up my mind, I get a tightness in my left side. And when I get this, I feel like letting everything go. This time I just took one and felt comfortable. Then I went to the socks department and I thought I would get size 9. But I thought they were too big and I was in confusion again. The tightness came back and I got flushed and I felt I couldn't breathe. I was on the point of throwing the socks down and leaving the store, but Doris said if they didn't have size 8.5, she was going to take size 9. So she made the decision for me. Then the tightness stopped immediately and I felt comfortable. 6 months ago, once the tightness had started, all kinds of other symptoms would have come on, and I would have been in a panic all day and maybe several days. Today, my panics last a short while, and they aren't a bit as severe as they used to be. Maurice, I used to make conflicts and dilemmas out of things the average person wouldn't think to make an issue of. For instance, going to a movie or getting a haircut. I would make a start, then I'd think, should I really go? Then I might pick up a book and read. After a few minutes, I would feel I should go to the barber's. Then I would put it off again, and so it would take me hours to make a simple decision. Months ago, I remember I went to the library and I would be in conflict about what books to take out. And for days, I looked over books and never took one out. That made me tense and disgusted because I couldn't make up my mind. Today, I can decide in a few minutes. Carol, my 2 children have been sick the past 2 weeks. I thought it would be nice if my husband would suggest eating out tonight. A year ago, I wouldn't have the nerve to make the suggestion. I would have been sore at my husband if he didn't make the suggestion himself. This time I said, "How about it?" And he was agreeable. But even now, I don't know whether it was right to ask. I got so tense when I have to ask for things. Frank, all this tenseness derives from the fact that we don't want to make up our mind. We are afraid we'll have to blame ourselves. We'd rather pass the buck. But we have to learn to make decisions and to take chances that we may be wrong. You know, the doctor tells us we must have the courage to be wrong in the trivialities of everyday life. Carol, I have another example. I have to take my wash to the laundry to have it ironed. Several months ago, I used to be tense on the way home because I had to rush back to prepare lunch for the children, and I was afraid I wouldn't make it in time. So I used to put off making the trip to the laundry and let it go day after day until we were almost out of laundry. Today I just do it, and if I feel tense on the way back, I say to myself, what of it? The tenseness isn't so bad anymore anyhow. Frank, these are examples of trivial conflicts, and the very fact that they are so numerous keeps us in constant tension, and the tenseness, of course, produces symptoms. I will give you an example of my own. As you know, I'm the editor of Recovery News, and there is an article I'm planning on writing, but I keep putting it off. Monday night I was home, and I thought I would start on the article, but didn't feel like doing it. Suddenly, it became important for me to read the daily paper. Ordinarily, I don't read it more than twice a week, but now it seemed I had to read it immediately. And so I got myself the Tribune and read it thoroughly. After I was through with it, I noticed the Sunday Tribune, and it was still on the table from the day before. I got a hold of that and read it again very thoroughly. Ordinarily, I'd hardly throw it a look. This you can call procrastination. But the point is, I didn't make up my mind to do something and I didn't feel like doing. I haven't been able to lick this procrastination of mine as thoroughly as I would like to, but I am gradually getting it under control. And on that Monday evening, when I kept putting off writing, I finally made up my mind and wrote and finished the article. Don, I used to buy medicine from a drugstore in the neighborhood. The clerk there knows about my condition because I told him. Now I am sorry that I told him because I feel uncomfortable when I have to go there to buy medicine. Of course, it is the stigma. When I need the medicine, I put off going to the drugstore. On several occasions, I was pretty sick with my asthma, but rather than talk to the clerk, I endured sickness. Finally, I needed the medicine badly, and my first thought was to again put it off. But then I said to myself, "No, sir, you know you will be tense all day if you don't make up your mind to face that clerk." And if I am tense, I get all kinds of symptoms: fatigue, sleeplessness, tremors. So I went and I got the medicine, and after that I felt I had done something worthwhile. Otherwise, I would have suffered all day. Imagination, temper, symptoms. Physicians' comments on the panel discussion. The central theme of today's panel was fear, more particularly the fear of making a decision. Tilly feared deciding between two pairs of socks. Maurice feared taking a book from the library, and Carol, Frank, and Don quoted similar fears in deciding, choosing, taking a stand, and reaching a conclusion. Frank surmised that all the issues and problems and conflicts and dilemmas listed by the panel members were sheer trivialities. But the fact is that Tilly, while grappling with her difficulty, developed panics and confusion and all manners of frightening symptoms. To her, the danger of making a wrong decision did not appeal did not appear at all a triviality. It loomed in her mind as a matter of momentous importance. She thought of serious consequences and grave responsibilities. She anticipated failure and disaster. In other words, her imagination was on fire. If there were no imagination, there would be few panics and anxieties. And without panics and anxieties, nervous symptoms would die away. No nervous patient would ever fear collapse unless his imagination told him that palpitations, air hunger, and chest pressure spell the was danger of an imminent death. Nobody would ever shiver at the thought of another sleepless night, except that imagination paints a lurid picture of the fatal results of that mythical sleeplessness has on health. I may mention the fanciful notions which patients entertain about the dreadful effects of nervous fatigue, and you will realize that the idea of danger created by your imagination can easily disrupt any of your functions. If this is true, it is clear that the nervous patient is served by an imagination which is out of bounds, rampant, and unbalanced. If the balance is to be restored, the patient will have to acquire a working knowledge of how his imagination functions. Clearly, all I can offer in a brief address is a sketchy account of its modes of operation. Imagination is either busy or idle. If idle, it is bored. If busy, it is interested and either stimulated or frustrated. Its business is to notice, observe, and interpret events. Once the event is noticed, imagination is aroused and stirred. It may then evince rising concern or stirring excitement. The concern will lead to further investigation and deepened interest, finally yielding some important or trivial discovery. The excitement will give rise to feelings, sentiments, and emotions. Note here that concern, excitement, interest, feelings are intimately associated with the function of imagination. Feelings. What imagination notices, observes, interprets are events, facts, and situations occurring outside or inside the body. Those taking place outside the body, in an external environment, strike the senses of vision, hearing, or touch and are grasped by them. This is the sensory grasp of outer experience. The events occurring inside the body, in internal environment, affect, or deep sensibility and are noticed by intuition. Our deep sensibility and noticed by intuition. This is the intuitive grasp of inner experience. We may then say that imagination is busy interpreting the facts of outer and inner experience. In the one sphere, it makes use of sense perception, and the other intuitive understanding. In interpreting the meaning of events, imagination classes them as either indifferent or significant to our welfare. The significant events are felt or thought of, that is, imagined as endangering or securing our welfare. In this manner, imagination produces the sense of security or insecurity. If behavior is to be adjusted, imagination must interpret events in such a fashion that the sense of security materially overbalances the sense of insecurity. Once this is accomplished, an imaginative balance establishes itself. After interpreting an event, imagination renders an opinion, which is in the nature of a tentative suggestion or a first guess. It suggests, for instance, or guesses that a person approaching you is a friend. The opinion is, then, that the situation is one of security. Under such simple circumstances, imagination is hardly likely to go astray. The situation is such that it calls for little or no imaginative appraisal. The sensory grasp is sufficient for proper identification. After the friend reaches you, his features may strike your eye as being changed. You imagine they express anxiety. This is another imaginative guess. If you accept it, you may be inclined to offer sympathy or aid. Suppose now that your guess was wrong. The offer of sympathy was then misplaced and may be resented. The tentative opinion rendered by imagination misled you to an incorrect conclusion and an equally unwise decision to act. In order to avoid premature conclusions, decisions, and acts of this kind, the opinion, this kind of the opinion, suggest or guess offered by imagination must be verified. I may mention briefly that verification makes use of logic, past experiences, and of that singular capacity of the mature human mind to observe elements which contradict or support an opinion after it has been formed. It is the tragedy of the nervous patient that after years of suffering he develops an unbalanced imagination, the first guesses of which tend distressingly and consistently to interpret inner and outer experiences in terms of insecurity. The greater tragedy is that the first guesses are accepted sight unseen without an attempt at verification. Unable to resist its suggestions, the patient becomes the victim of his imagination. An incessant stream of insecurity suggestions is poured forth with rapid fire velocity, leading to a continuous succession of wrong opinions, conclusions, and decisions. The final result is that the patient, realizing that his first guesses tend to be either wrong or harmful, comes to fear forming an opinion, reaching a conclusion, or making a decision. In a sense, his fears are based on good logic. In most instances, imagination has misled and deceived him. On 100 or 1,000 occasions, it told him that his sensations will lead to collapse. The suggestion never materialized. How can that imagination be trusted? Whenever a symptom made its appearance, whether palpitations or numbness or dizziness, imagination suggested invariably that this was the last gasp that an emergency was on. The patient went into panic, clamored for instant help, insisted that the doctor be summoned without delay. When the relatives, aware of this nervous nature of the spell, hesitated to call the physician, perhaps in the dead of the night, the patient passed into violent bursts of temper, and the wish had to be granted. But the moment the physician arrived, his mere presence or calm manner dispelled frequently both symptoms and temper in a trice. The deceitfulness of his imagination was here clearly demonstrated to the patient. It lied to him, led him to the wrong conclusion, to hasty decisions. It produced temper, caused unnecessary expense, created domestic friction. First of all, it undermined his self-respect and made him look ridiculous. Trusting an imagination of this kind, it would seem, is impossible. There were other experiences that made for distrust. Neighbors mentioned a remedy, or a patient read about it in the daily paper or heard of it on the radio. No sooner was the drug called to his attention than his imagination absurdly fired with hope and enthusiasm. In the course of years, he spent more money on pills and capsules than his meager finances warranted, trusting the suggestions passed on by his ever lively imagination. He consulted numerous physicians, wandered from clinic to clinic. He made costly trips because of a change of the climate was supposed to be beneficial. He went to sanitariums, watering places. He even had himself checked into Mayo Brothers. His record of inept conclusions and ludicrous decisions is impressive indeed. That record was inspired by his imagination, whose erratic and capricious counsel has been the ruin of the patient's reputation. How can he ever base a decision on its dubious recommendation? It happened at times that he was free from symptoms for a few days, sometimes for a week, rarely a longer period. Then this imagination spoke the language of security. It suggested that he was cured, that the symptoms were gone for good. On these occasions, he concluded he was well and decided to do things. He resumed his social life, visited friends, played cards with them, went fishing and automobiling. Occasionally, he ventured to return to work. The result of these efforts was dismal disappointment. Without any warning, out of the blue sky, the palpitations reoccurred, worse than ever, right while he was engaged in a grand game of poker, or he suddenly fainted while he worked on the bench. There was no escape from these dreadful symptoms. His imagination, even when it preached security, invariably led him straight into insecurity. How can he ever be trusted? How can he depend on its first guesses or final conclusions? And without dependence, be how can there be deciding or acting? His life is doomed to be a stark tragedy, a bleak and barren existence, mechanical, tedious, lifeless. We shall revert to the experience Tilly had in the store. When she was unable to make up her mind whether to buy smaller sized socks for her daughter, Doris came to her assistance and made the decision for her. Then the tightness stopped, and immediately I felt control, Tilly said. But if a little child can guide the nervous patient out of confusion and bafflement, the solution for the difficulty seems to be close enough at hand. Every patient has either children or mothers or friends. It should be easy, or at least feasible, to assign to them the task of making decisions and reaching conclusions. Unfortunately, the device does not work. Men and women have pride, and that pride is readily shaken, wounded, and challenged. The fact that Doris had to make the decision for her was a severe blow to her mother's self-respect. It served to emphasize her tragic inability to act, to decide, to be self-sufficient. It accentuated the helplessness and wretchedness of her existence. Doris Doris's intervention, it is true, relieved the symptoms of tightness and discomfort. Now Tilly's physical person felt secure for the brief period of a few minutes, but her moral and intellectual personality was made to feel more insecure than before. The next decision to be made was certain to reveal an increased distrust of herself and of her imagination. To trust imagination means to let it perform its functions of dreaming, hoping, and anticipating. If Tilly had given free play to her fancy, she would have planned the purchase of Doris's dress days or weeks in advance. She would have pictured in her mind, that is, in her imagination, how beautiful the child would look in the dress for a certain style, cut, or color. She would have anticipated flattering compliments from neighbors and friends. She would have beamed with joy at the thought of Doris's delight when she finally presented with the garb. On an evening walk with her husband, she would have strolled along the show windows, viewing patterns, tentatively accepting some, rejecting others. All along her thought would have dwelled fondly and proudly on the details of the situation, when, a week or two ahead, she would arrive at home with the garment neatly wrapped in a box. The surprise and breathless suspense, the ceremonial unwrapping, the grasp of astonishment wringing from the child's lips, the kiss of gratitude, the eagerness to slip into the dress immediately, and eye it in the mirror. All of this and many other dreams, hopes, and anticipations would have currently crowded Tilly's brain, continually feeding and occupying her imagination. This is precisely the point I mean to make. The acts of planning, dreaming, hoping, and anticipating keep the imagination busy and occupied, interested, and stimulated. They prevent idleness and boredom. And if imagination is properly kept from being idle or bored, there is no or little occasion for restlessness or irritability. And without restlessness and irritability, symptoms do not stand much of a chance of being maintained or precipitated. Had Tilly permitted her imagination to be occupied with dreams and hopes, her chest would have currently swelled with pride, and her heart would have habitually expanded with joy. Instead, her chest became a seat of agonizing pressure, and her heart was rocked by wild palpitations because her imagination was allowed to busy itself with fears and anxieties, mainly or solely. What prevented her from keeping her imagination fruitfully occupied was her preoccupation with terrors and panics, with symptoms and distress, in short, with the idea of insecurity. And if the imagination is more or less constantly preoccupied with ideas of insecurity, it will be deprived of the opportunity to occupy itself with those dreams, hopes, and visions from which ideas of security originate. If this happens, the imaginative balance will be disturbed. The thoughts of insecurity will drown out the ideas of security, and anxious preoccupation will cancel out the pleasurable occupations. The result will be a paralyzing fear of deciding, planning, and initiating and acting. But without decisions, plans, actions, and initiative, there is no possibility of developing pride, self-reliance, or self-sufficiency. It was a sustained preoccupation with ideas of insecurity that prevented Tilly from acquiring even the modicum of self-trust that prompts the trivial decisions of daily existence. You will understand now that if the nervous patient is to regain his lost imaginative balance, his preoccupations with ideas of insecurity will have to give way to occupations with thoughts of security, that is, with hopes and dreams and pleasurable anticipations. You will also understand that hopes, dreams, and joyful anticipations are the very warp and woof of decisions, plans, and conclusions. And if you ask how you can manage to rout your preoccupations, my answer will be in the simplest kind. Stop listening to the threat of the symptomatic idiom and the im- imbecilities of the temperamental lingo. Your imagination will again be able to indulge in its stimulating occupations, and you will be in a position to make decisions, draw conclusions, formulate plans, without fearing the dreadful consequences suggested to you by temper and symptom. Learn to use recovery language of self confidence and fearlessness, and your imagination will be freed of the dead weight of panics and anxieties. Thus delivered, it will once again occupy itself with thoughts of security and the idea of self sufficiency.